Hey everyone, in this video I want to bring a bit of security awareness around a really important topic, and that is dangling DNS. So I want to explore what exactly this is and then some of the things we can do to mitigate and protect ourselves. But first, as always, if this is useful, I really would appreciate a like, subscribe, comment and share, and hit the bell icon to get notified of any new updates. So let's take a step back and realize what I'm going to talk about. Yes, I talk about Azure all the time, but this really applies to any kind of public cloud you might be using. Now within Azure, I can create public facing services. This could be an app service plan, a container instance, a traffic manager, a front door. There's a whole gamut of different things I can actually use. Now with these services, there's a public IP. So I could think about, hey, in my subscription, I create a resource group, and then I create my resource. Let's just say, for example, it's an app service. So it's sitting in an app service plan. Now, this app service has a public IP, but we're not really good with public IPs. So what we're going to actually do is, well, Azure gives us a DNS name, and it will give us something that's kind of Azure websites.net, which points to that public IP address. And it would be the name of our app service. So in my case, maybe I've created an app called Bad Father, which I use for a lot of my demos, .azurewebsites.net. So it goes and creates that for us, and that's kind of visible, and I could absolutely go and connect to that. For example, if I jump over right now and look at my environment, just get an idea of some of these, well, I can see, yes, I have, if I go and search for app services, you can see I've got some app services here. Oh, I've got my Bad Father app service, and it has a name. Now you'll actually notice I've got kind of a special URL because I've added a custom domain for later on in our demo. But what we could see by default is over here, we just have this badfather.azurewebsites.net. And I could absolutely just go and connect to that. I could go and use that. And there's me being a bad father because my son is terrified on Rock and Roll Roller Coaster, then terrified on Splash Mountain. And I'm really just having some fun there. But other services have that same kind of own Azure flavored name. If I went and look at traffic manager profiles, well, hey, my SavlTM traffic manager, it has a name of, well, savltm.trafficmanager.net. So there are these names out there that are created for us that, yes, we could use. And if the public IP changed, because it was kind of dynamic, it would update to point to the new name. So that's a great thing. However, as, let's say, my company, I don't really want to make this Azure flavored DNS name available to my end users, customers, partners, whatever that might be. And so this kind of record here is a host record. It's pointing a name to an IP address. But I can add my own record. So I could think about, well, I can hide this. I may have my own DNS zone. So in this case, a completely different DNS service that I'm hosting, a public DNS zone, I might have onboard to azure.com. That could be hosted at Network Solutions, GoDaddy. Azure has public DNS zones, but you have someone authoritative for that zone. And what I can actually do is I can create my own name under here. Now, I could call it www. I might call it Bad Father. I can give it a name. So I might create something called a CNAME. So a CNAME basically points to another DNS name. So in this case, I'm going to create a CNAME called Bad Father, which actually points to badfather.azurewebsites.net. So now people could actually go and use that name instead. And that's exactly what I've done. So if we jump over to my Azure public DNS zone. So I've actually got onboard.azure.com hosted in Azure. And if we look at my records, well, hey, yeah, look, I created this bad father CNAME record that points to badfather.azurewebsites.net. And you can just add these. So I could go and add a new record. I'll say, hey, it's a CNAME. And I could type this in, whatever name, hey, www.onboard.azure.com could point to whatever name I put in for this alias. So this all seems fantastic. I can hide that name by doing these kind of CNAMEs in my zone. And what's actually interesting is a lot of Azure services are really on board to this. The other thing I want to note before I jump over is this time to live. They have a time to live of 3600 by default, but I can change that time to live record. So the whole point of a time to live is, as an end user machine, if I actually want to go and talk to badfather.onboard.azure.com, well, I have to go and do kind of a name server lookup, and then it's lookup, and it might be a recursive, it has to bounce around different zones. If I'm constantly talking to it, I don't want to keep doing that request every single packet I want to send. So once we kind of get that resolution back, we cache it. And we cache it for a period of time. So 3600 means an hour. And that's generally okay, because these DNS records are not going to constantly change what they point to. So realize, even if this now went away or something else happened, it's cached on this machine for that 1 hour period of time. But again, the Azure services actually do things to help me with this. So now I've got this other name, badfather.onboard.azure.com. It could be www, whatever your service is. You're hiding this Azure name. Well, things like app service actually understand this concept. So if I go back to my app service, well, I can actually add the fact that, hey, I have this custom name. And you can see I've already done that. So I added a custom domain, and I added in my custom domain this badfather.onboard.azure.com. Now, when I did that, it actually went and did a check. And it says, well, does badfather.onboard.azure.com actually point to badfather.azurewebsites.net? Because realize, I can add any name I want in the app service. But to prove I really own onboard.azure.com, well, a way to prove that is, hey, can you create a record in there? And I proved it. I created badfather.onboard.azure.com that points to that badfather.azurewebsites.net. So I did that proof. I proved that I own, and it's legitimate. This is me creating this, the owner of onboard.azure.com, because I was able to create a record that pointed to this. So I've proven to app service, yeah, this is really legitimate. It's really something onboard.azure.com. So what app service will then actually let me do is, I want to do HTTPS, I want to do encryption. Well, I could absolutely upload my own certificate, or once I've done that proof, well, Azure will actually create an app service managed certificate for me. As long as I've got that record, I've proved I own it, which I've done. It won't let me create another one because I've already done that name, but it created me the cert. Down here, it created me this badfather.onboard.azure.com certificate, and I then used that certificate to bind to that custom name. So you can see I've got server name indication binding. So this is now HTTPS encrypted. And we can see that. So if I go to this badfather.onboard.azure.com as HTTPS, it works. And we can go and inspect, well, what certificate am I using? So up here in the corner, I've got the little padlock. If I select that little padlock, and then connection is secure, up the top, it will show me the certificate. And I can look at the details and the certification path, and it was issued by DigiCert. That's really kind of trusted by everyone. So Azure is using DigiCert. They went out and actually got me a certificate. So now I actually have HTTPS to that app service, and I was able to get that because, well, hey, We had that alias record, which proved it's really me. Only I could possibly do that. So we have that created. And if we looked at something like terminal, for example, let's just open this up quick, we can see this. So if over here I do an NS lookup, badfather.onboard to azure.com, well, we can see, okay, so badfather onboard to azure.com actually resolves to badfather.azurewebsites.net, which actually is an alias itself to this. This is what's actually then publishing the service, and then we actually get to an IP address. So we can see all of that in action. And so far, kind of all of this is fantastic. Great. I've got this alias, I've hidden it. John, what is the big deal? So what is this whole dangling DNS thing you're alluding to? And I've gone to all of these steps to show this because what happens next is super important. So this is all good stuff. Now imagine the project's finished. Imagine, for example, hey, I've gone through parenting classes, I'm not a bad father anymore, or this was some initiative we had in our company or something else, and I'm done. Okay, so what do we normally do when we finish with a certain resource? We're kind of educated to, we create things in a resource group together, they run together, they get deprovisioned together. So I would go and delete this resource group and everything in it. So the app service goes, the public IP goes. This disappears as an entry currently. This no longer exists. Resource group, everything's gone. Okay, so now this still exists, because remember, this is in a different zone. This is in my DNS zone. So badfather.onboard to azure.com points to a name that does not exist. Big deal. But that CNAME is still there. It's what we know as dangling. It's existing, it's pointing to a name, but that name no longer exists. So now here's the problem. There are bad actors out there who want to impersonate your company. So if I'm a bad actor, I'm constantly looking for these. I'm looking for these dangling DNS. So I now, as a bad actor, could come along, well, I'll create my own resource group, I'll create my own app service, and I'll call my app service Bad Father because it's been vacated. I'm not using it anymore. So when I call my app service Bad Father, well, it's badfather.azurewebsites.net. Well, that record points to that name. So that record actually now points to the same name. It's just that name is now hosted over here with its service. So I've essentially now had someone take over the record. The record still exists in my zone, but it now points to their service. And remember, I have a record that's legitimate in my zone pointing to their service. So now in app service, I could say, hey, go and create me a managed certificate for badfather.onboard to azure.com. And it will say, well, I need to check that. Are you really on board to azure.com? Oh, well, there's an alias record that points to this. Must be you. It will now create it an SSL cert. So now these people doing this lookup will now be talking to this bad service. So now people are talking to that bad service. That bad service might harvest credentials, might spread disinformation. It's part of your DNS domain. So if you had like a wildcard cookie, it has access to that. If I had things like cross-origin resource sharing, I can attack with that information. So this is actually a huge issue that I do not want to happen. Now I'm stressing it with names. Technically, it could also happen with IP addresses. Maybe I've got a host, an alias record, an A record, pointing to an IP address. But it's harder for an attacker to take over a public IP. If I vacate a public IP, I as an attacker can't request that IP address. IP addresses are kind of randomly given out. So it's a much smaller risk. Someone could take that over. It's possible, but it's a lot less likely as an attack vector. But it could happen. Also realize it might not just be DNS that is a problem here. Imagine I had another application. In that other application I host, I link to things, maybe code. And in my code, I've kind of hard-coded a link to badfather.azurewebsites.net. So I really want to be careful all of these various things I might be doing. But the key point is I don't want to leave these dangling DNS things around. So what can we do? So the first thing is kind of education. Make sure we educate that, hey, if you're creating these records to point to cloud services, again, I'm talking about Azure, but this applies to all of them, as part of the deprovisioning process, there should be a checkbox or something that before we start deleting this stuff, we delete this first. Because remember, I don't want to delete this, then delete this. Because remember that time to live, that cache, even if it's 1 hour. Well, if I delete this, as soon as I delete this, that bad person could come along and create this. And even if I delete this straight away, if someone's cached it, they're still going to go there for an hour. So it's still an hour window I don't want. So I want to think about, well, I deprovision this first, and then once that's gone, time to live has expired, then I can go and delete this resource. So education, process, make sure it's part of that deprovisioning process. Hey, we delete the record. We wait the time to live, then we go and delete the resources. See if there's things that can actually help protect me. So I talked about the app service. Well, app service also has a protection. There was actually 2 in app services. So one of them is when we did this kind of custom domain, there's actually this custom domain verification ID that it generates just for this app service. And what I can actually do to help someone else try and take that over in the future, as in addition to adding kind of that alias for bad father, you can actually also add this. So this is this asuid.badfather. It's a text record that has that identification in it. So what would now happen is if someone else took that app service name and it went and checked this record, so it went and checked for bad father, yes, it points to it, but it wouldn't match. Their app service would have a different verification ID. They can't force that in. So when it went and looked at the DNS record for the text for that ID, it would not match their app service. The app service will not honor the traffic. It will not accept it. So that's a way you can protect yourself. So make sure when you add these aliases to app service, go and take that second step and you go and add the asuid.alias name and you put in that identification. Another protection for app service is that there is Defender for App Service. So Defender for App Service will actually go and look for these dangling records and it will find them and warn you to help try and protect you. If I'm using Azure DNS, one of the nice things I can actually do when I create a new record, there's this idea of an alias record set. This is only if I'm using Azure for the DNS, actual hosting of the public DNS. But if I say yes, what actually happens now is I put in some name for this new record I want to create. Let's say I'll create a CNAME and it's demo 1. I can link it to an actual resource. Now I can only do traffic managers, CDN, front door, static web app for that. If I do it as an alias, then I can also do public IP addresses. So what's happening now is it's linking the life cycle of these 2 things together. So if I was to delete this public IP, it would remove the record set. So I'm now tying them together. So if I delete the resource, it's going to wipe out the value of this record. So now it's not pointing to anything someone else could go and hijack. So it's actually going to help give me those protections. So that is a really nice thing I can do as well. So there's some of the things you can do to help mitigate, but fundamentally, you really want some kind of process running. Yes, I'm educating the users. Yes, I can use things like the app service protection and Defender. If I'm using Azure to host that public DNS, I can link it to certain types of resource. But if you think about from your DNS, you have a whole bunch of records. So I can kind of think about, hey, from here, I can kind of dump out my kind of CNAME records. I can look for Azure names, i.e. the Azure websites, whatever. And then if I find it, check exists in my subscriptions. i.e. so dump out all of the kind of alias records in my DNS zone, compare what it points to for the list of kind of known Azure suffixes. If it finds, hey, it does point to Azure, now maybe use Azure Resource Graph, which is a very effective way to scan. Hey, does this actual resource still exist? If it does, great. If it doesn't, warning, 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 I would probably go and then create a resource to capture it again while I go and clean up the DNS. Now, the good news is there are things to help you. So there's actually a entry here. So this is on GitHub. So this actually goes and generates the dangling domains for a tenant. So this can be used by Azure customers. I've got the link in the description. You can go and run this and it will actually go and find these. So notice these are showing me all the different types of CNAME and ending names that it will go and look for. So there's Azure Front Door, Storage, Azure CDN, Public IPs, Traffic Manager, Container Instances, API Management, App Services, App Service Slots, i.e. deployment slots. So it's going to go and look for anything pointing to any of those, and then it will go and look at your Azure subscriptions to make sure it still exists. Now, I can run this kind of manually as this PowerShell, or maybe I go and put it in as an Azure function and just have it firing off every couple of minutes or something. I can absolutely do that. So this is something to help protect you. Microsoft actually has a good document, and I put this in the link as well. So it talks about a lot of the stuff I talked about already. This is talking about, hey, these idea of people taking it over. Again, it talks about those different types of names that it might point to. It talks about that script. How I can protect. So again, the Azure Defender, the Azure DNS alias records that link it to the lifecycle, custom domain verification using that ID I showed you, and just creating the procedures and everything else. There are great resources. So there are things you can absolutely do to protect yourself initially, and then there are things I can do to go and find them, hopefully before the bad guys do. But this is super important for everyone. Everyone needs to consider this and have a plan, because you don't want some bad actor taking over something that you are pointing to. Because again, you're basically proving it's valid, because I have an entry in my DNS that only I as the company could possibly add, pointing now to something. So they can go and get those certs. They're acting as you. They can harvest and do bad things. So protect yourself. Think about dangling DNS. Do something about it. Don't wait till tomorrow. And protect you, your customers, your partners, and everyone else. I hope that was useful. A bit of awareness, things to do. Again, links in the description below. Until next time, take care.